Good day. My name is Tosin Balogun, and today I want to talk about early signs of autism. But first, what is autism? Autism is a developmental disorder, which means it starts from early childhood, that is characterized by deficits in social interaction, communication, and repetitive pattern of behavior and thought. Now, it's important to know about what the early signs of autism are, because many times when we conduct assessment for children and we're communicating with families and you begin to ask them some questions and shed some light into some things, you begin to hear them say things like, oh yeah, I suspected this when the child was 1 year, I suspected this when the child was 2 years, but I didn't read much meaning into that. Of course, that is fine, but that's why it's important that we know the early signs so that the moment you begin to suspect these things, you can begin to seek for the proper help. Because remember, early intervention is key. And you cannot get early intervention unless you recognize early signs and therefore go for early assessment that will lead to early diagnosis for your child to get early intervention. All right, and then can improve or at least can increase the likelihood of your child doing really well in terms of intervention goals and progress. Now, so I'm going to consider the early signs based on early communication signs, early social interaction signs, and early signs of behavior and interest that may um, give you the inkling that a child may have autism. Now, what are the early communication signs? Um, when did you realize that a child may have difficulty with nonverbal communication? For instance, the ability to interpret and use gestures. Now, take for example, at the age of 12 months, a child should be able to follow the direction of a pointing finger of an adult. That is, if I point in the direction of something, the child should be able to turn their head and look in that direction. That is a significant sign, and some children find this difficult. If you realize this, that might be an early sign of autism. Sometimes, of course, it's also about the usage of this gesture. For instance, at the age of 15 months or so, a child should be able to get into a place and see a number of toys and be able to point in the direction of the one that they want and say, give me that one, or give me this one, or this is what I want. When you find that um, there's a form of delay in this, that might be an early sign of that might be an early sign of autism. The other thing to consider under communication has to be speech, of course. Sometimes there is a total absence of speech, but sometimes there is speech, and what you might realize is that there is just a delay, or at least when you consider the amount of words or vocabulary they use, you can begin to suspect that there is some form of limitation here. So maybe a child has very limited words, a few words that they use, or when you consider the way that they use these words in terms of the pitch, in terms of the tone, in terms of the reading, um, you might begin to suspect that something might be odd here. When you have this form of suspicions, or when you get these signs, then that might be an early indication of autism. Now, let's talk about early signs that are related to social interaction. Um, if you find that a child does not, for instance, respond to your smile, all right, if you find that a child does not maintain eye contact, this might be an early sign of autism. If you find that a child does not respond to their name when called, or you realize that there's a significant difference between the time it takes for them to respond to their name after they've been called, this might be an early sign of autism. You could also realize that a child may not be very willing or open to share playtime with people, otherwise, what we'll call joint attention. So you get into the child space or trying to play with them, and you realize that they're pushing you away or they just want to walk away. Something that we say maybe the child was just want to be in their own world. This might be early signs of autism. So now let's talk about early signs that are related to repetitive behavior and interest. And then we're going to talk about play first. There could be some specific repetitive movement that you may find. For instance, you could give a child a doll to play with, and instead of them to engage in parallel play, as it were, with the doll, you could find that the child is just preoccupied with one part of that doll. For instance, it could be the hand of the doll, and they just keep rolling the hand or taking it out, putting it back in, taking it out, putting it back in, as opposed to playing constructively with the toy. It could also even be a toy car. And then, of course, instead of the child to drive the toy car, what you find is that the child is maybe playing with the wheels of the car over and over again. You know, those could be an early sign of autism. There could also be repetitive behaviors that you may find odd. For instance, a child could get all the shoes in the house and begin to line them up. They could get the toys and begin to line them up. And if you get there and try to scatter the arrangement, of course, it could lead to a big tantrum. Um, Things like that could be early signs of um, autism. There could also be some signs that you may call sensory related signs. For instance, a child could be staring at the source of light this way, or there could be some mannerisms that they do with their hands, flipping their hands this way and then doing this sort of movement. Those things could be early signs of autism. Um, Sometimes you also find that a child may just find it difficult to self-regulate themselves, especially when you want them to sit in a place. You've put a child on a chair and you realize that they just want to be on the go. Or maybe when they even eventually try to sit, they just cannot maintain appropriate posture. Sometimes they're slouching, sometimes they are kicking their legs and doing all sorts of things. Those may be early signs of autism. Now, of course, aside from all of this, sometimes what you may find is that there is just a general regression in skills. All right. When you find out that some of the milestones your child has achieved, some of them are beginning to go away. In other words, the child is beginning to lose some of these skills. When you find a regression like that, you need to consider that this might be early sign of autism. Now, what do you do? Um, when you find some of these signs in your child, that does not categorically say that your child has got autism. No. But what it does say is that your child needs to visit a professional. You need to get up early and go visit a professional. Now, of course, you can choose to visit your family physician to get the medical opinion. You could choose to go to your child's pediatrician, but you could also choose to go to a center or institutions that you know work with children with special needs. You could also call on professionals in the field. You could call on a speech and language pathologist. You could call on an applied behavior analyst, or you could call on an occupational therapist. You could just, as long as you know that you're going to seek help, it's quite important. Um, do not take anything for granted, because remember that early intervention is key. And you cannot get early intervention unless you get early assessment that will lead to early diagnosis. And that's why it's important for you to be aware of these early signs of autism. Thank you.